What if I told you that the greatest danger to Middle-earth was never the ring, nor the armies of Mordor, but something much older, darker, and completely forgotten? Imagine a moment when three unthinkable forces could have united: Smaug, the dragon whose breath could reduce kingdoms to ashes; Larachna, the ancestral spider that devoured even the light; and the Balrog, the living flame of the abyss, which even the Valar feared to name. Three entities so powerful that had they marched together, Tolkien's story would never have known a happy ending. But something forbidden and almost philosophical, prevented this from happening. A secret about the very nature of evil, about pride, greed, and hunger. A hidden weakness that Sauron himself could never overcome. Today we're going to delve into that forgotten side of the legend, the point where power and chaos nearly collided, and where the world's salvation was born, not from force, but from the disunity of shadows. Before we begin this journey into the depths of darkness, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching this from now? And what time is it there? It's always interesting to see how far these stories reach. And if you enjoy delving into this kind of revelation, where every detail changes everything we thought we knew about Middle-earth, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That way, you can continue with me on this journey through Tolkien's hidden truths, where even darkness has secrets worth hearing. Imagine a moment when fire, shadow, and web met, an impossible moment, where Smaug, Cancra, and the Balrog would cease to be isolated creatures and become a living army of destruction. Three distinct forces, each driven by its own purpose: greed, hunger, and pride, but which, united, could have extinguished every spark of hope in Middle-earth. Just imagining this scenario makes the heart of any Tolkien scholar hesitate, because if this alliance had happened, there would have been no elves, dwarves, or men capable of stopping them. The light of Valinor would have been extinguished in the echo of a roar, in the rustling of giant webs, and in the awakening of a fire that burned before time. But the most curious thing is that Tolkien never wrote about this union, and yet it hovers over his pages like an unrevealed ghost, a forbidden possibility that forces us to question, why has evil, so powerful in its forms, never managed to unite? The answer lies not only in battles, but in the mentality behind these creatures. Sauron understood the power of organization. He dreamed of an empire of total order, a dominion where every being, orc, troll, Nazgul, obeyed a single will. Smaug, the dragon, reigned through isolation, through the vanity of one who considers himself self-sufficient. He saw no allies, only potential rivals. Cancra, in the depths of Cirith Ungol, had no interest in power. She devoured everything that breathed, guided by an instinct so ancient that not even fear could stop her. And the Balrog, silent in the darkness of Moria, was older than Sauron himself. A spirit of fire that walked beneath the two trees of Valinor before being lost in the abyss. None of them were born to serve. None of them would recognize a master. And it is precisely there that the paradox of evil resides. The greater the power, the less the capacity for unity. This thought reveals something much deeper about the workings of evil, both in Tolkien and outside of fiction. Evil is competitive, proud, self-destructive. It doesn't share, it consumes. And while good is born from empathy and connection, evil feeds on loneliness and fear. It is a force that grows by devouring itself, like a flame that burns intensely before extinguishing itself. Sauron tried to build a system in which all darkness would bow to him. But even his will was not enough to align creatures that existed before time, shaped by desires so primal that they bordered on chaos. The hidden truth behind this contrast is that in Tolkien, destruction never comes only through force. It comes through disharmony. Evil is incapable of building. It only fragments, divides, disintegrates. And this weakness is what saves the world. Because if these three creatures had ignored their differences, if for an instant their natures had aligned, there would have been no wall, sword, or song capable of resisting. Imagine Smaug sweeping the skies, the Balrog emerging from Moria in flames, and Cancra weaving webs. Around Mordor, transforming the very earth into a living prison. Sauron's power would have reached divine dimensions. The Third Age would have ended before it even began. But this union never happened because evil, in its essence, is incapable of trust. And trust is the first step for any empire to endure. This idea carries a powerful revelation. It wasn't just the courage of the hobbits or the wisdom of Gandalf that saved Middle-earth. It was also the inability of evil to organize itself. Smaug's pride, Cancra's blind hunger, and the Balrog's isolation created gaps among the shadows. Each of them, in their own way, sabotaged Sauron's dream without even realizing it. They were like gears turning in opposite directions, preventing the machine of darkness from functioning. It's an irony that echoes in the subtext of the work. Evil, however grand it may seem, always carries within itself the seed of its own ruin. And there's an even more fascinating detail in this reasoning. Tolkien, in creating this universe, doesn't just describe battles and kingdoms. He describes mentalities. Each creature represents an aspect of the corrupted soul, the blinding pride, the consuming desire, the swallowing emptiness. And when observing Smaug, Cancra, and the Balrog, we realize that they are not isolated monsters. They are reflections of what purposeless power generates. In all of them, there is a kind of silent tragedy, an inability to feel belonging. They are entities that live at the extreme of their own strength, and therefore have never understood harmony. What is most striking is that this idea serves not only as a metaphor within mythology, but also as a reflection on the real world. Great empires in history and in life do not always fall due to external attacks. They fall from within, due to pride, vanity, ego, and a lack of shared purpose. It is the same principle that governs Tolkien's monsters. None of them failed due to a lack of power. They failed because power, without direction, turns against itself. This is the hidden truth that hangs over the entire legend of Middle-earth. Evil does not lose through weakness. It loses through an excess of itself. In imagining this league that never existed, we also discover a mirror. Each creature is an archetype of what power does when it finds no balance. Smaug is the reflection of greed that accumulates until it suffocates. Cancra is the image of spiritual hunger, of the emptiness that consumes everything around. It and the Balrog is the embodiment of pride, of the fire that prefers to burn alone rather than share its warmth with another. Three incompatible natures condemned to eternal solitude, and it is precisely this solitude that prevented total ruin. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. There is something profoundly symbolic in the way Tolkien conceives of evil. He never treated it as a single, solid, or coherent force. On the contrary, evil in his mythology is fragmented, like a flame broken in 1,000 directions, unable to burn with the same intensity for very long. This division is key to understanding not only Sauron's downfall, but also the very workings of his creatures. On one side, primal chaos, represented by Smaug, Shelob, and the Balrog, an evil born from ancient, wild, and almost natural impulses. On the other, absolute control, rational, calculated, and centralizing evil, personified in Sauron. One side is instinctive and free, the other is systematic and obsessive. This fracture within the darkness itself is what prevents evil from achieving perfection, and paradoxically, it is what guarantees the survival of the light. When Tolkien constructs this contrast, he is in fact exposing a hidden truth about the nature of power. Every tyranny needs order, but every dark essence yearns for chaos. It is a contradiction that corrodes any empire, whether in Mordor or any other realm of existence. Smaug would not obey orders, Shelob would not follow strategies, and the Balrog would never bow to a master. Each of them represents a different face of the natural rebellion against absolute dominion. And this rebellion is not moral, it is structural. It is born from the very instinct of those who live only for themselves, who recognize nothing above their own desires. It is as if evil, however much it seeks to impose itself, carries within itself the virus of self-sabotage. Sauron, with his ambition to dominate all of Middle-earth, believed he could organize even chaos. He wanted to transform disorder into a tool, convert fear into obedience and pain into discipline. and for a long time he succeeded. The armies of Mordor marched under a seemingly infallible command, each orc fulfilling its role, each Nazgul obeying without hesitation. But what made him seemingly invincible was also what made him vulnerable: his need for control. He did not understand chaos as a creative force. He tried to stifle it, mold it, subdue it to his will, and therein lay his weakness. Chaos, after all, cannot be governed. It is resistance to domination itself. It's interesting to observe how Tolkien transforms this philosophical opposition into something almost psychological. The ordered evil of Sauron is a reflection of the ego that wants to dominate everything around it, while the chaotic evil of Smaug, Shelob, and the Balrog is a reflection of raw nature, unfiltered desire, and instinctual impulses that consume. They are two poles of the same energy, but they can never coexist in harmony. Absolute control requires predictability, and chaos is, by definition, unpredictable. One seeks discipline, the other wants freedom. One builds empires, the other destroys everything it touches. Coexistence between them is impossible because they represent opposing ideas about what power is. This contradiction is what makes evil, in Tolkien's universe, something far more human than one might imagine. It is not merely a mythological shadow. It is a reflection of the inner condition itself. How many times in human history have we seen the same dynamic? Governments, ideologies, and empires attempting to organize the uncontrollable, only to discover that total control leads to collapse. It is the eternal struggle between rigidity and instinct. Sauron represents the tyranny that seeks to dominate even thought. Smaug represents the ego that believes it needs no one. Shelob is the void that consumes everything that approaches. And the Balrog is the ancient pride that prefers silence to servitude. None of them can coexist because they all compete for the same invisible crown. This division, this shared heart of evil, reveals a profound philosophy. The more absolute power tries to be, the more fragmented it becomes. Evil, however grand it may seem, is incapable of creating true unity. It only maintains itself through imposition, fear, and the illusion of control. Good, on the other hand, is sustained by something simpler and harder to corrupt: choice. Elves, men, and even hobbits fight not because they obey, but because they believe. And this difference changes everything. In a sense, Tolkien shows us that evil is like a structure that collapses under its own weight. It may seem stable, but its foundation is made of vanity, ambition, and distrust. Sauron wanted to unite the world in a single purpose, but his most powerful creatures were incapable of recognizing any purpose other than their own. And it is this disconnect that causes evil to always fail in every age. Smaug, for example, destroys Erebor only to sleep on mountains of gold that he cannot use. Shelob devours everything that enters her cave, even that which could strengthen her. The Balrog isolates itself in Moria, guarding a dead empire like a king without a kingdom. They are all symbols of power without purpose, strength without direction, will without vision. The great revelation here is that Tolkien didn't just want to narrate the struggle between light and shadow. He wanted to show the contrast between mental systems, one driven by cooperation and the other by obsession. Evil tries to centralize, good decentralizes. Evil wants to dominate, good shares. And when we look into this symbolic mirror, we understand that the downfall of evil is not divine punishment, but a natural consequence. No empire of tyranny can last, because nothing born of fear generates true loyalty. There is a dark beauty in this truth. The same fire that empowers Sauron is what consumes him from within. The same force that makes Smaug invincible imprisons him in his own greed. The same hunger that drives Shelob to devour the world leaves her eternally unsatisfied. And the same pride that keeps the Balrog alive prevents him from returning to the light. This is the essence of the shared heart of evil, a set of wills that do not know how to coexist, forces that repel each other while trying to dominate the same space. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. There is something unsettling about Shelob, something that transcends the simple idea of a monster lurking in the shadows. She is not an ordinary being, nor a creature that can be defeated with swords or spells. Her presence carries a truth older than Middle-earth itself, the truth of the void. Direct daughter of Ungoliant, the devourer of light, Shelob inherited not only her mother's monstrous body, but the essence of what Tolkien describes as the endless hunger. It is not a physical hunger, nor even a desire for power. It is an existential need, an impulse that consumes everything that exists just to try to fill something that will never be filled. And that is what makes Shelob more fearsome than any army of Mordor. She does not fight for conquest, she feeds on existence itself. When Tolkien describes her hidden in Cirith Ungol, he's not just talking about a giant spider. He's talking about an echo of forgotten ages, a remnant of the time when the world was still forming from primordial chaos. Shelob lives at the point where creation and destruction merge, where instinct is stronger than any purpose. Sauron, with all his power and arrogance, knew it was impossible to control her. He tolerated her presence only because her hunger served an indirect purpose, to protect the path to Mordor, not out of loyalty, but out of convenience. The border of his kingdom was guarded not by servants, but by something he himself feared. And this detail reveals one of the darkest truths of Tolkien's mythology. There are forces in Middle-earth that not even the Dark Lord dared to challenge. Shelob is the antithesis of control. While Sauron desires order and dominion, she represents absolute chaos, a living entropy. Her hunger has no logic, it follows no patterns. Today she devours an orc, tomorrow a Nazgul, and then perhaps a simple lost traveler. She does not distinguish allies from enemies because her mind does not operate in terms of hierarchy, power, or strategy. She is pure instinct, pure absence of purpose. And precisely for this reason, she symbolizes something deeper, the fear of that which cannot be understood or corrupted. There is a difference between evil that can be confronted and evil that simply exists. Shelob belongs to this second type. She is natural evil, the abyss that does not think, that does not feel, that does not care. But what makes this figure so fascinating is the philosophical dimension behind her nature. Shelob's hunger is not merely destruction, it reflects an ancestral pain. The same pain as Ungoliant, who, even after consuming the light of the two trees of Valinor, remained empty. Tolkien seems to be telling us that there is a kind of power that does not seek to dominate but to exist. A power born from lack, from inner emptiness, from the inability to complete oneself. And it is this kind of force that challenges even the gods. Because while Sauron's power depends on control and objects, the One Ring, the armies, the fortresses, Shelob's power is internal, irrational, unpredictable. She is a reminder that some forces in the world want nothing in return. They only want to continue devouring. Behind the scenes of the story, Shelob represents a universal archetype, that of spiritual hunger. It's the same principle that drives greedy kings, corrupt empires, or souls that are never satisfied, no matter how much they conquer. It's the idea that emptiness, when not understood, becomes voracious. And Tolkien, with his symbolic genius, transforms this hunger into a creature. She doesn't speak, doesn't think, doesn't negotiate. She is the living portrait of meaninglessness. When Gollum finds her, guiding Frodo and Sam to her lair, he knows she doesn't seek the ring or power, only flesh, life, presence. And this detail changes everything. Shelob is not Sauron's enemy because of ideology, but because of nature. She is the reflection of a world that feeds on itself until only darkness remains. The horror that Larachna evokes doesn't stem from her appearance, but from what she represents. She is a reminder that the universe contains forces that simply cannot be redeemed, not out of malice, but because they were not born to understand the concept of redemption. In a world of choices and free will, she is what is off balance. She is like a storm or an abyss. There is no intention, only consequence. And this idea creates a different kind of fear, deeper, almost existential. Not the fear of death, but the fear of that which has no purpose, the fear of being swallowed by something that is unaware of what it destroys. The way Tolkien positions Shelob on the chessboard of Middle-earth is almost poetic. She exists on the border between Mordor and the world of men, between order and chaos, between organized power and nameless hunger. Her cave is the symbolic threshold of insanity, the final test before entering the heart of darkness. And that is why the passage through it becomes a metaphor for the entire hero's journey. Traversing the darkness that cannot be defeated by force, but only by inner resilience. The light of Galadriel that Frodo carries is not used to kill Shelob, but to confront her, to remember that even in the depths of the void there is still a spark of hope. Shelob, therefore, is not merely a creature of horror. She is a lesson about the limits of power and the danger of losing oneself within one's own desires. Her hunger is the rawest reflection of what dwells within any being, constant dissatisfaction, the endless search for something that never arrives. And the more she devours, the more the emptiness grows. It is an endless cycle, a downward spiral that reveals the tragedy of her existence. She is not evil because she chose to be, but because she cannot be anything else. This is the essence of the existential horror that Tolkien presents to us, the terror of a consciousness that never awakens, of a being that continues to act even without understanding why. Ultimately, Larachna is a mirror of humanity's own hunger, the hunger for power, control, and recognition, a hunger that can move empires and destroy worlds, but is never satisfied. Her story is a living metaphor for the danger of trying to fill the void with more emptiness, for the trap of seeking meaning only through possession or destruction. And that is why she defies even the gods, because she represents that which even they cannot cure, the nothingness that exists within everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Cirith Ungol was the kind of place where even the wind seemed to carry memories of pain. The narrow pass, carved between mountains of dark rock, was more than a geographical point. It was a symbolic border between the world of the living and the realm of shadows. There, where light rarely dared to enter, Shelob reigned without a throne, without crowns, and without followers. No army swore allegiance to her, and yet her presence kept entire armies at bay. Mordor tolerated her existence, and this tolerance was one of Sauron's coldest and most calculated decisions. He knew that chaos has more power than it seems, and that there are monsters whose mere presence serves as a living wall. The relationship between Sauron and Shelob was never a formal pact. It was a silent agreement, a forced coexistence between two evils that recognized each other but did not belong to one another. She did not serve him, and he did not dare to control her. Each knew that the other's existence was useful but temporary. Mordor needed a guardian who did not need orders, someone whose ferocity could not be bought or bribed. And Shelob, in her blind and ancient hunger, found in that dark valley a home that demanded nothing but silence and darkness. It was a distorted symbiosis, chaos watching over order, hunger protecting the empire that fed on fear. It's curious to see how this unspoken alliance became one of the most effective strategies in Sauron's history. No general could have planned a defense as impenetrable as that of a creature who doesn't even understand the concept of duty. Cirith Ungol was the natural bottleneck for anyone trying to reach the heart of Mordor, and Shelob transformed this ravine into an invisible graveyard. Her webs weren't just physical traps, they were symbols of the fate of anyone who dared cross the territory of shadows. The most fascinating thing is that she wasn't defending Sauron, she was defending the void. And that detail changes everything, because while armies marched with purpose, Shelob acted on impulse. She didn't protect Mordor, but served as a cruel filter between the world of the living and the world of damnation. Behind this balance of conveniences lies a hidden truth about power and manipulation. Sauron understood that dominating the world wasn't just about gathering armies, but about knowing how to use unpredictable forces to his advantage. He didn't need to conquer Shelob, just leave her where she was. She did the work for him like a shadow that didn't demand orders. This mentality reveals something about leadership and control. Sometimes, true power lies in allowing chaos to work for you. Tolkien transforms this concept into a powerful metaphor for human behavior. How many times do empires, governments, and even individuals use fear and destruction as a way to maintain control? Shelob is fear incarnate, and Mordor knew how to benefit from it. Behind the scenes of this relationship, tension was constant. Orcs avoided her passages, Nazgul feared her, and even the winds seemed to change direction as they approached her lair. The nearby fortress, with its twisted towers, served as an outpost, but no one dared cross Shelob's path. She was in a way the living frontier of Mordor. No warrior could replace the kind of terror she inspired. The mere rumor of her presence was enough to deter invasions. And the most ironic thing is that throughout the centuries, she served Sauron's purpose more faithfully than many of his conscious servants. This dynamic between chaos and control exposes something essential about the nature of darkness. It doesn't need harmony to be effective, only fear. Shelob didn't follow plans, but the result of her hunger kept Sauron's world in balance. It's as if the shadow itself understood its role without needing to hear orders. Tolkien, with his subtlety, transforms this contradiction into a reflection on mentality and purpose. Absolute power, however disciplined, always depends on elements outside its control. And perhaps that is the most frightening lesson of all. The greatest empires are sustained by forces they do not completely control. The presence of Shelob also represents an emotional boundary in the narrative. Entering her cave is the moment when the hero abandons all certainty, where light and logic cease to function. Cirith Ungol is the threshold of the unknown, the final test before transformation. There, fear ceases to be merely a sensation and becomes a language. Tolkien describes this environment not as a battlefield, but as a spiritual experience, a plunge into the essence of despair. And by placing Shelob at this point, he suggests that there are evils that cannot be confronted with swords or armies, but only with inner strength. Throughout his journey, Frodo traverses this territory and discovers something that transcends the physical: the silence of Mordor. This silence is not an absence of sound, but of hope. It is the suffocating stillness that precedes collapse, the kind of emptiness that consumes even the air. And it is in this setting that Shelob's true nature is revealed. She is part of the environment, part of the very evil that inhabits Middle-earth. Her existence needs neither words nor intentions. She is the pure instinct of destruction at rest, a reminder that some forces remain because the world needs them as mirrors of what must not be repeated. That's why her relationship with Mordor is so paradoxical. She doesn't serve but protects. She doesn't obey but helps. And perhaps without realizing it, Shelob was one of the reasons why Sauron maintained his dominion for so long. Her mere presence deterred heroes, diverted paths, and corrupted the psychological balance of those who dared to approach. This silent pact between hunger and empire is one of the most fascinating elements of Tolkien's mythology. It shows that evil, however structured, always relies on something that escapes reason, and that is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Smaug was not merely a colossal beast shrouded in fire and golden scales. He was, in essence, the innermost reflection of human vanity and greed. Unlike creatures such as Shelob or the Balrog, who acted on instinct or memories of divine ages, Smaug thought. He calculated, admired himself, and saw himself as a kind of self-proclaimed god, a deity shaped by the brilliance of his own treasure. His power lay not only in his fire, but in the unwavering belief that nothing in the world could challenge him. And it was this mentality, this inflamed pride, that condemned him long before any arrow touched his heart. Gold was his mirror and his prison, the symbol of what he had conquered, but also the poison that slowly consumed him. When Smaug seized Erebor, he did so not merely out of material desire, but out of a need for dominion. He could not bear to see anything beautiful and grand that was not his. The kingdom of the dwarves represented what he could never create, a solid, patient, and disciplined civilization. So, in taking possession of the lonely mountain, Smaug did not merely destroy a kingdom. He appropriated the work of others like a thief of legacies. The gold that the dwarves forged with sweat and centuries of devotion became the fuel for his own arrogance. There he rested upon his accumulated riches, blinded by the reflection of his own brilliance, deaf to the world transforming around him. Each coin around him was a reminder of what he believed himself to be: invincible, eternal, absolute. There is something profoundly tragic about this kind of power. Smaug is not the symbol of pure destruction, but of stagnation. He conquers to remain immobile. He reigns so that nothing else grows. In his blazing solitude, he becomes the perfect portrait of golden decay, a power so great that it doesn't need to act, only to exist. But that is precisely where the paradox lies. The gold, which he believes he possesses, is what possesses him. Tolkien transforms this idea into a reflection on mentality and ambition. Smaug is not just a dragon. He is the metaphor for the ego when it reaches its peak and loses itself. His story is a slow tragedy, built not by battles, but by silence. The kind of silence that echoes in the depths of Erebor, where his every breath makes the gold tremble. As if the mountain had a heart of its own. Sauron, on the other hand, observed from a distance. He understood the symbolic value of creatures like Smaug, and knew that the dragon represented something more dangerous than an army. Smaug could set cities ablaze, but the true fire was in his mind, a flame of pride and vanity that could be exploited. And that is where the strategic genius of the Dark Lord is revealed. He wouldn't need to control Smaug, only suggest it. A promise, an idea whispered in. The shadows would suffice, and the dragon, in his self-sufficiency, would believe he was acting of his own free will. Sauron knew that the greatest power is not that of direct command, but that of manipulating desire. And Smaug's desire was as clear as the gold he guarded. Gandalf, with his foresight, understood this threat before it materialized. He knew that if the dragon ever allied with Mordor, the world would fall into ruin before the rings of power even fulfilled their destiny. Smaug, driven by pride, would be the perfect weapon, not because he would obey, but because he would believe he was dominating the enemy. The mind that does not accept control is the easiest to deceive, and the dragon's ego made him vulnerable to the most subtle manipulation, that of recognition. Give him glory and he will transform it into servitude. Tell him he is free, and he will become a prisoner of his own vanity. This is how Sauron operated. He did not force, he offered. This point in the story carries one of the deepest truths about power and its pitfalls. Smaug believes himself to be the center of the world, but he is merely a piece on a larger chessboard. He thinks himself untouchable, but his own greed creates the isolation that weakens him. No servant betrayed him, no sword wounded him prematurely. What defeated him was the habit of believing that nothing else existed beyond himself. Tolkien uses this as a metaphor for leadership and destiny. How many kings, warriors, or empires have fallen in the same way? Not because of external enemies, but because they became prisoners of their own reflection. Gold here is more than just metal. It is the symbol of the illusion of permanence. It is the mirror in which the ego admires itself until it forgets that anything exists beyond it. Behind the scenes of the story, there is another fascinating aspect to Smaug: his intelligence. He speaks with irony, thinks logically, and seduces with words. He is the charm of corrupted power. His voice is not that of an irrational monster, but of someone who truly believes himself to be superior. And it is this distorted humanity that makes him so terrifying. He is not driven by hunger, but by intellectual vanity. When talking to Bilbo, for example, Smaug doesn't try to devour him immediately. He tests him, manipulates him, plays with his mind. There is pleasure in domination, not only physical, but psychological. And this reveals what differentiates him from Tolkien's other creatures. Smaug thinks like a man and feels like a god, but is blind like a tyrant. The impact of his existence extends beyond Erebor. While Smaug slept upon his gold, the north of Middle-earth plunged into a state of imbalance. Trade routes were lost, neighboring kingdoms weakened, and fear spread like a silent disease. He didn't need to leave his mountain to destroy. His mere presence was enough to alter the political and spiritual equilibrium of the continent. It was as if the world breathed cautiously, while the dragon dreamed. This invisible influence is what Tolkien mastered like few others: the symbolic power of evil at rest, the terror of knowing that something could awaken at any moment. Smaug is, therefore, the personification of arrogance transformed into destiny. His fall is not merely the end of a creature, but the revelation of a truth. All power born of the ego is condemned to solitude and ruin. The gold he amassed was not a treasure, it was a mirror reflecting back to him the image of his own decay. That is why, even in death, he remains present in the stories and fears of Middle-earth. Because pride, unlike the body, never disappears. It spreads like dust over gold, waiting for the next mind to breathe it in. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Sauron was never merely a tyrant in black armor or a lord of countless armies. His true power did not stem from brute force, but from his ability to understand the hidden weaknesses in the souls of others. He did not to conquer by the sword, but by suggestion. He was a master of temptation, an architect of desires, and his most dangerous weapon was not the One Ring, but a precise understanding of what drives every creature. While other leaders used threats, Sauron used promises. He offered exactly what the other already wanted, and made it seem as if the choice came from the victim's own heart. Therefore, when discussing the art of manipulation, it is impossible not to recognize that Sauron mastered it with the same mastery with which a musician masters the silence between notes. He knew that fear breeds resistance, but desire breeds surrender. That was his philosophy. Behind every dark pact, there was an exchange of wills, a king who desired eternal glory, a warrior who feared oblivion, a sage who yearned to understand what the gods concealed. And in all these cases, Sauron never imposed anything. He merely planted a seed, an idea, a possibility, and let the other's mind do the rest. It's the same kind of control that doesn't seem like control, the kind that seduces through freedom. When a man believes he is choosing, he is already trapped. And that is precisely why Sauron's dominion was so effective. No one perceived the exact moment they became a servant. The story of the Rings of Power is the clearest example of this tactic. Sauron, disguised as benevolence, taught the elves to forge what they believed to be instruments of wisdom and balance. He offered knowledge, not imposition. And the elves, driven by the desire to perfect the world, accepted his help. This is how evil entered through the doors of beauty, without noise, without battle, only with the promise that they could make good even greater. This is the essence of deception, transforming virtue into a trap. Sauron did not corrupt with obvious lies, but with distorted truths. And when the liquid gold of the rings solidified, the fate of Middle-earth was already sealed. Sauron's manipulation didn't depend on words, but on perception. He observed, studied, and waited. He understood the nature of each being better than they understood themselves. This is how he corrupted mortal kings, transforming them into the Nazgul, promising them enough power to rule beyond death. They believed they could dominate their own kingdoms forever, but ended up dominated by their crowns. Sauron's trick was always to make the poison seem like a gift. Instead of taking what he wanted, he taught the other to give it. It's an ancient technique, as effective in Tolkien's world as in reality. Whoever controls desire controls destiny. When one speaks of Smaug, the dragon of Erebor, it is impossible not to imagine what would have happened if Sauron had set his sights on him. The Dark Lord would have quickly perceived the dragon's weakness, pride. Smaug did not wish to destroy the world. He wanted to see it kneeling before his name. This was the perfect opening. It would have been enough to insinuate that there was an even greater treasure, a power that would make him not only rich but eternal. Sauron would not need chains to control Smaug, only well-placed compliments. He would make him believe that total dominion was his natural right, that the fire of his glory should spread throughout Middle-earth. And while the dragon believed he was expanding his reign, he would only be serving a greater purpose, one he would never fully understand. This is the dark beauty of manipulation. It doesn't force, it convinces. It doesn't push but invites, and Tolkien knew this. Behind the wars and armies there is a much more subtle struggle, the battle for the mind. True evil doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't appear grotesquely, but with the appearance of truth. The same pattern repeats itself throughout the mythology of Middle-earth. Morgoth promising freedom to the rebellious Maiar and Valar, Sauron promising order to the mortal peoples, Saruman promising wisdom to those who followed him. All believed they were choosing the path of reason, when in reality they were moving away from balance. It is a manipulation that operates on the most dangerous scale, the mental one. Behind this strategy lies an almost psychological logic. Sauron understood that fear is only useful up to a certain point. Ruling through terror creates resistance, but ruling through desire creates loyalty. He cultivated an emotional relationship with power, making the other person feel they were growing, evolving, transforming the world. Manipulation became a kind of mirror, reflecting the ego of the observer. That's why so many succumbed without realizing it. He didn't impose his will, he made the other person believe that the will was his. That's the difference between a tyrant and a manipulator. The former needs to be feared, the latter needs to be admired. Sauron never needed long speeches, a brief promise, a partial vision of what the other wanted to achieve, and the mind did the rest. That's how evil survives. Not by imposing its presence, but by becoming indispensable. The dragon, the kings, the wizards, all at some point were touched by that invisible energy that Tolkien describes as true dominion. Because in the end, the One Ring is not just a magical object. It's a metaphor for the absolute power to influence without being seen. It represents the temptation to want to mold the world in one's own image, and that's the kind of power that never comes without a cost. The hidden truth behind Sauron's success is that he didn't need to win battles. He only needed to conquer wills. And in a way, that's one of the most unsettling lessons of the work. Evil doesn't conquer because it's stronger, but because it's more patient. It waits for the moment when desire overcomes discernment, and then it acts. No sword stroke is as fatal as an idea that takes root in the mind and seems just. That's how empires fell, how kings were lost, how heroes were corrupted. And that's how Sauron almost molded all of Middle-earth in his image. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Among all the forces that moved in the shadows of Middle-earth, there was one that not even Sauron dared to provoke. The Balrog, the ancient flame of Morgoth, was more than a monster. It was a living reminder of the age when chaos itself walked the earth. A spirit of fire and darkness, born before the counting of days, forged in the same divine breath that shaped the great beings of light. It served no one, answered no orders, and bowed no kings, not even the Dark Lord. Sauron understood this truth with cold clarity. To maintain absolute dominion over fear, he could never share the throne of shadows with anyone who looked upon him as an equal. The Balrog was not a controllable creature. It was unfiltered power itself, the primal energy that precedes morality, law, or command. While Sauron represented rational, methodical, and disciplined evil, the Balrog symbolized destructive instinct in its purest form. It burned simply to exist, not to conquer. Its strength was not sustained by legions or artifacts, but by an essence that emanated destruction, like an echo of Morgoth's first cry. And that is precisely why Sauron feared it, because he saw, in the flame of that being, the memory of that which he could never control. There was a presence in Moria so ancient that even the stones seemed to retain the heat of a forgotten hell. And under that fire, Sauron's pride dared not venture. The relationship between these two powers was never one of alliance, but of mutual recognition. The Dark Lord knew that the Balrog was the only being in all of Middle-earth capable of challenging him, not out of ambition, but out of nature. A force that needs no purpose cannot be subjugated. The Balrog does not desire dominion, only existence. He does not conspire, he does not seek thrones, and precisely for that reason, he is dangerous, because there is nothing to offer in return. Sauron's manipulation worked. With kings and warriors, with men and elves, with anyone who had desires. But the Balrog was the opposite of desire. He was raw will, a spark of chaos itself. Sauron, master of lies and mind games, knew that pride is the weakest link in power. And the Balrog was a mirror of this lesson. If the One Ring represented absolute control over wills, the Balrog was the negation of that control. It was a reminder that there are forces in the world that do not bend to fear or promise. And on some level, this wounded Sauron's ego. Because what is a tyrant without the capacity to dominate all that exists? That is why he never tried to claim Moria. That subterranean domain, shrouded in silence and fire, was a wound on the map of power, a territory where his influence ended. There is a powerful philosophical dimension to this contrast. The Balrog represents absolute freedom, but a freedom that transforms into destruction. It has no master, but it also has no purpose. It is the portrait of power that finds no direction, a force that neither serves nor creates. Sauron, on the other hand, is the personification of corrupted order. He wants to shape, plan, control. And in this game of opposites, both represent the extremes of the same evil. One is senseless chaos, the other soulless discipline. Tolkien seems to suggest that neither of these poles can win, because both are condemned to self-destruction. The Balrog's fire consumes what it touches. Sauron's control suffocates what it dominates. Neither generates life, both only distort it. Behind this tension lies something even more revealing. Sauron understood that the Balrog was a constant reminder of his own limitations. He, who saw himself as Morgoth's successor, knew that his authority was merely a shadow of the ancient power the Balrogs represented. These spirits had fought side by side with the first Dark Lord, and their flame carried the legitimacy of the original chaos. For Sauron, challenging the Balrog would be like confronting the very memory of the master who created him, and pride would not allow him to place himself in that position. That is why he avoided it, not out of cowardice, but out of strategy. He knew that the Balrog's presence was an unsettling reminder. There are forces that not even the One Ring could subdue. This dynamic between fear and pride reveals something profound about the nature of leadership and ambition. All absolute power fears what it cannot control. The true danger for Sauron was not an enemy army, but the existence of something that defied his logic. The Balrog, in its silent independence, symbolized exactly that. It didn't need the world needed to fear it. And Sauron's pride could not bear the idea of a power that did not bow to its hierarchy. Deep down, it was as if both knew that coexistence would be impossible. There is also a symbolic dimension to this tension between them. The Balrog's fire is the same fire that, in another context, represents the divine spark, creation, life, transformation. But in him, this energy was corrupted and converted into eternal destruction, and perhaps that is what made him so uncontrollable. He was a force without balance, fire that does not bend, that does not obey, that recognizes no boundaries. In every step that being took through the depths of Moria, echoed the sound of what happens when creation loses its meaning and power becomes pure instinct. The contrast between Sauron and the Balrog goes beyond the war between two evils. It is the exposure of two types of pride. The first is the pride of domination, the desire to impose order on the world. The second is the pride of absolute freedom, the desire to belong to no one. And both, ultimately, are destructive because they are born from the same principle, the refusal to accept limits. The Balrog, in its living flame, is the refusal of all submission. Sauron, in his organized darkness, is the refusal of all spontaneity. They recognize each other as mirrors of the same disease, power without balance. Tolkien, in an almost spiritual way, transforms this relationship into a reflection on mentality and destiny. Every being that seeks total dominion, whether over the world or over itself, ends up burning in its own flames. The Balrog is the extreme example of this, the fire that refuses to be extinguished, even when there is nothing left to consume. It is a reminder that power that does not bend ends up consuming itself in its own intensity. And Sauron, with all his cunning, knew this. That is why he kept his distance, because in trying to control what is too pure, the controller dissolves. The Balrog's flame is the most perfect metaphor for pride. Beautiful, powerful, fascinating, yet impossible to touch without being destroyed. It represents the limit of dominion and the consequence of arrogance. While Sauron used darkness to hide his intentions, the Balrog burned openly, a symbol of power that does not disguise its own danger. And, perhaps for that reason, it remained silent in the depths. The world had already forgotten its name, but not the echo of its roar, because fire that does not bend may slumber, but it never disappears. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The curious thing is that even without a formal pact, the forces of chaos ended up serving Mordor with almost supernatural efficiency. Sauron never needed to order anything. The very imbalance of the world worked in his favor. Moria, where the Balrog slept beneath the ruins, became an impassable abyss. No army dared cross those depths, and the ancient dwarven road, which connected the west to the east, died with them. The north, once rich and promising, fell under the dominion of the fear left by Smaug, and trade routes were lost, leaving kingdoms isolated and vulnerable. To the south, Cirith Ungol became a silent graveyard, covered in webs where Shelob devoured anything that dared to cross. Unbeknownst to them, each of these monsters formed a living wall, an invisible circle of protection around Sauron. It was the silent triumph of disorder, chaos serving control without ever knowing it. This is one of the darkest ironies in Tolkien's mythology. Evil did not triumph through the force of unity, but through the synergy of fear. The creatures who hated dominion and despised orders ended up protecting, with their mere existence, the one who wanted to dominate everything. It's as if nature itself, corrupted and fragmented, had inclined itself to Mordor's purpose uninvited. Sauron understood this dynamic and accepted it coldly. He didn't need to control chaos, he simply had to observe it and let it do its work for him. It's a lesson in strategy and patience, a revelation about how power works. Sometimes true dominion lies not in forcing destiny, but in knowing how to wait for it to bend in your favor. What is most fascinating is that this invisible victory was not orchestrated, but emerged. The Balrog, in its contained fury, closed the heart of the mountains. Smaug, in his silent greed, destabilized the north, and Shelob, in her eternal hunger, made the entrance to Mordor almost impenetrable. Each, isolated in their own selfishness, contributed to the advance of darkness. It is the perfect portrait of tragic irony. Evil wins not because it plans well, but because good tires, scatters, and underestimates the small alliances of chaos. None of them marched under Sauron's banner, and yet all worked for him. Not out of obedience, but out of nature. This revelation leads us to reflect on mindset and purpose. How many times in human history have opposing and even chaotic forces ended up serving the same objective without realizing it? Chaos has this capacity. It creates the ideal conditions for control. When fear reigns, the mind seeks a leader. When disorder dominates, people yield to the first one who offers stability. Sauron understood this better than anyone. He didn't need to conquer every frontier. It was enough to allow the world itself to fragment around his shadow. While the peoples of Middle-earth isolated themselves, fought and hid, Mordor grew in silence. Behind this irony lies a philosophical contrast that Tolkien masterfully constructs. Good demands unity, dialogue, courage. Evil, on the other hand, thrives on division. It is more efficient because it is simpler. Chaos needs no planning, it simply exists, and that is enough. When the forces of Middle-earth scattered, when kingdoms fell into ruin and ancient alliances broke, the field opened up for Sauron to act. He didn't need to build walls because fear and greed had already built them for him, and this is the central point of this silent victory. Evil prospers when the world gives up on cooperating. There is also a spiritual symbolism in this scenario. Each of these creatures represents a type of corruption. Smaug is the corruption of desire, the pleasure of possessing. Shelob is the corruption of hunger, the impulse to devour what sustains. And the Balrog is the corruption of faith, power that, without purpose, transforms into destruction. Isolated, these forces seem distinct, but together, even unknowingly, they form the invisible body of evil. Sauron is the mind that observes, but the corrupted world is the body that moves on its own. This idea carries an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not need to be in command to win. It is enough for good to fragment enough to leave the path clear. This victory of chaos is also a portrait of the nature of Tolkien's own world. He never believed that destruction came only from tyranny. It also arises from indifference. Every creature that chooses to act only for itself contributes to the weakening of the whole. The dragon that sleeps on gold, the monster that hides in its cave, the spirit that burns in silence, all are symbols of a power that isolates itself and therefore ends up serving the very evil it intended to avoid. And, in a way, this is the greatest. Trap, the pride of isolation creates the perfect walls for the dominion of darkness. The impact of this revelation goes beyond mythology. It speaks to the invisible decisions that shape empires, civilizations, and even individuals. Chaos is patient. It infiltrates the intervals of inaction, the cracks in vanity, the pauses of fear. Sauron didn't create Smaug, Shelob, or the Balrog. He merely understood how to profit from what already existed. This understanding made him more dangerous than any army. Because the true strategist doesn't need to move the pieces, he simply observes and waits for each one to destroy itself at its own pace. And while Middle-earth tried to rebuild itself, Mordor fed on the imbalance. Each fallen kingdom, each forgotten road, each ruined mountain was a reminder that evil doesn't need to be present to be felt. It lives in the consequences, in the absences, in the paralyzing fear. Sauron's victory wasn't visible in the battles, but in the minds that ceased to believe in unity. And that's why this part of the story is so revealing. It shows that evil is most efficient when the world is distracted, when no one realizes that the simple act of doing nothing is already a form of contribution. In the end, this is the essence of the invisible victory of chaos, the triumph of a system that functions even without command, the victory of a plan that never needed to be planned. Sauron understood that fragmentation was his best ally, and while the heroes looked at the walls of Mordor, believing that the danger was within, the true power was already spreading everywhere, silent, subtle, inevitable. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Evil always presents itself as an insurmountable wall. It rises with an appearance of solidity, as if it were eternal and absolute. But behind this imposing structure there are cracks, small, invisible to the naked eye, but inevitable. And it is in these cracks that time works, patient and silent, until everything collapses. Tolkien understood this with almost prophetic clarity. Evil does not fall because it loses strength, it falls because it loses cohesion. No empire of darkness can withstand its own disorder, and no creature driven only by pride, greed, or hunger can walk alongside another for long. That is why darkness always crumbles, not by the direct action of light, but by its inability to remain united. Sauron believed he had learned from Morgoth's failure. He attempted to build an organized, meticulous, disciplined evil, an empire where everything was under command, where even fear had a hierarchy. But what he never realized is that evil is not sustained by control, only by desire. And desire is volatile, changeable, untamable. It can be awakened but never tamed. Each creature that served Sauron did so for its own reasons, some out of fear, others out of ambition, still others for the simple pleasure of destruction. None of them truly believed in something greater than themselves. And when there is no shared belief, no structure can endure. This is the hidden truth behind the ruin of Mordor. Sauron's fall was not merely the result of the hobbits' bravery or the strength of the allied armies. It was the collapse of a system built on vanity. The Tower of Barad-dûr crumbled because its foundations were made of ego and domination. Every orc who fought did so to survive, not out of loyalty. Every Nazgul obeyed because fear chained them, not because they believed. And when the One Ring was destroyed, it wasn't just Sauron who fell. It was the artificial bond that held that structure together. Fear dissolved, and with it, the Empire. Evil, after all, has no roots. It spreads quickly, but dissolves just as quickly. when it loses its center. It's interesting to consider that evil in Tolkien is not an autonomous force, but a distortion. It doesn't create, it only imitates and corrupts. It's an imperfect reflection of light. Sauron forged the One Ring to dominate the others, but to do so he needed to place part of his own essence within it, and it is precisely this detail that condemns him. Evil, to exist, always needs to cling to something, to an object, a form, a promise, and this dependence is its greatest weakness. Light, on the other hand, needs no shackles. It spreads without owner, without borders, without dependence. Evil centralizes, light shares. That's why, in the end, darkness never completely wins. Greed, pride, and hunger are the pillars that sustain the shadow, but they are also the elements that divide it. Smaug, Shelob, and the Balrog could never march side by side, because each of them is a slave to their own impulse. The dragon isolates itself in its gold. The spider hides in its cave. The Balrog consumes itself in its own fire. Each believes itself complete in itself, and it is this belief that weakens them. Good, in contrast, is born from unity. None of Tolkien's heroes is invincible alone. Frodo only reaches the end because Sam carries him. Aragorn only reigns because he trusts others. Gandalf only triumphs because he shares wisdom. The strength of light lies in surrender, that of shadow in possession. And everything that is possessed is one day lost. This lesson is deeper than it seems. It speaks of mindset, of how true transformation comes not from conquest, but from connection. Evil believes that power comes from domination, but real power comes from understanding. Morgoth and Sauron fell because they confused dominion with meaning. They wanted to mold the world in their own image, but the world does not bow to vanity. It resists, balances itself, regenerates itself. Darkness, however absolute it may seem, always carries within itself the germ of its own ruin. Tolkien reminds us of this through a recurring pattern. The more evil tries to concentrate on a single point, the more fragile it becomes. The more light spreads, the stronger it becomes. That is why the victory of light is never definitive, but it is also never impossible. Evil returns, always in new forms, always disguised, but it carries with it the same flaw, the inability to love. Love, in Tolkien, is more than affection. It is the power that holds things together. It is what prevents fragmentation. It is the antidote to chaos. And when the light seems lost, it is always for lack of love, never for lack of strength. When hearts close, the world darkens. When they open, even in silence, the dawn returns. This understanding reveals a greater truth about the human journey. Evil, just like in Tolkien's stories, doesn't disappear. It changes form. Sometimes it takes the form of fear, sometimes ego, sometimes indifference. It infiltrates when people stop looking at each other, when pride replaces empathy and power becomes more important than purpose. It is at this point that darkness finds room to grow, but it is also there that light is reborn, because a small act of compassion is enough to break the cycle. Light doesn't win by force, it wins by persistence, and that's precisely what makes Tolkien's message so timeless. His stories aren't about wars of swords and rings. They're about the silent choices that define the world's destiny. The true weakness of the shadows is believing that power can exist without purpose, that domination can replace meaning. But as long as there are beings willing to share the burden, to bear the weight, to extend a hand even in the dark, the light will always find a way. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. And if you've made it this far, it's because something in this journey also spoke to you. Perhaps that mix of mystery, reflection, and that feeling of discovering something that has always been hidden in the subtext of the stories. That's precisely what we seek here, to transform what seems like fantasy into something that makes sense within our own journey, with the same doubts, choices, and hidden truths that drive each of Tolkien's characters. So if this kind of immersion makes you think differently, inspires you, or simply makes you want to continue exploring this universe, subscribe to the channel. That way, You can continue following each new story that brings a little more light into the shadows. And since you stayed until the end, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it now? It's always amazing to see how far these stories reach and how somehow they end up connecting people from completely different places. Oh, and if this conversation resonated with you, leave a like, not as an automatic gesture, but as a silent sign that this exchange was worthwhile. There's a video over here that complements this topic. Click on it and continue with me there. The next part of this journey awaits you.